What's up, everyone? I hope you had a great Thanksgiving if you do celebrate. I know that we're jumping into winter and Christmas season, but if you're anything like me, it's kind of Halloween all year round. And one of my favorite genres that I always find myself coming back to is dark wave and post-punk. And I've really enjoyed this kind of resurgence of post-punk and dark wave music with artists like I Dress and Ecstasy. And so I wanted to show you guys how to make something that's kind of in that style where it's like it is still retro sounding, just like it would have been in the 80s. Still has a lot of fun guitars, but at the same time it's a bit more modern sounding, a bit punchier, and you can still get a really clean mix with this type of stuff. If you don't already know who I am, my name is Sebastian. I'm a producer and a multi-instrumentalist, as well as a singer in the band London's Falling. You can check us out. And I love producing all types of genres and being able to experiment with everything from producing rock to hyperpop and pop and hip-hop and everything in between. So without further ado, let's dive into it. Alright, so a lot of this is going to be guitar based. All of the older music would have been recorded on real amps. Nowadays though, obviously a huge amount of people are using VSTs and amp simulation plugins. And for this, I wanted to just go ahead and do it in that way. I actually ended up using, if I go here into my console, I ended up using this Marshall Plexi Classic just on the first input. And here's kind of a little bit less bass, the treble up a little bit, and some presence kind of bringing it out. Honestly, I just wanted to keep it simple and just have a nice kind of high gain, like adjacent kind of sound for it. Play around though and experiment with different plugins. You could use like Tone Hub is a great one. You could use Guitar Rig. There's a bunch of different great ones. I know all the Neural DSP stuff is really popular right now. So for this guitar, if we dive into it, I actually used a Les Paul for this. Personally, I like the thickness of the humbucker pickups, especially for rhythm guitars. It just adds a really nice warmth and thickness. A lot of people that I see making this style of music are using Stratocasters though. So for all of the rhythm guitars in this track, I doubled them and I panned them not completely hard left and right. You can see here in Ableton, I have it panned 22 left and about 25 right. Doesn't really matter. I like to, again, think about it. If it was an analog knob, you wouldn't have a number. You would just kind of twist it and be like, cool, that sounds good. If I turn off all the processing on these guitars, this is what each guitar sounds like when I recorded it. One thing that I do know is on my guitar, I didn't want it to be so bright because I wanted to leave room for the lead guitar to really be like this fuzzy, bright guitar. So I turned the tone knob a little bit down just so it would darken the sound and the overall tone of the guitar, which you can really hear when, especially when there's no reverb or anything on it. It sounds very dark. So here's what they sound like together. Sounds nice and wide. I also added a little bit of reverb to each guitar. I'm just using Ableton stock reverb. You can of course use whatever your go-to reverb is. I've actually been liking the hybrid reverb in Ableton a lot recently, but this is just the stock standard reverb, 31% dry and wet and 2.1 seconds of decay time. I left the size on 100 and pretty much left everything else as is, and I have the same exact reverb on the other guitar as well. As you can tell, it gives it a nice amount of space, and when we actually bring that into the mix, it has this sort of industrial room kind of feeling, which is exactly what we're going for in this type of music. As far as chord choices and actual writing goes, for these songs you typically want to stay in a minor key, maybe even try a drop tuning. I also like to try and play around with the voicings of the actual chords, so it has like a really nice voice leading, and when you're listening to it, the rhythm guitars almost have a melody in them besides just the chords itself. So if we go into our lead guitars, we do have the exact same amp settings as before, so let's take a listen to what just the lead guitar sounds like on its own. I try to just really emphasize what the rhythm guitar is playing. Honestly, a lot of these lead parts are very simple and easy to follow along with. a lot of my favorite riffs from this type of music can be played on one string alone. So don't try and overcomplicate it and write this crazy guitar virtuoso melody. Keep it simple with just eighth notes mostly, and just have fun with it. If I play this with the rhythm guitar, you can see it doesn't really stand out too much. It blends right in with the rhythm guitars, and I knew that wasn't something I wanted it to be. A lead that really sits on top of the rhythm guitars and gives a nice bright tone to the song. I started off with some pitch shift on Little Altar Boy, just turning the Foreman and the shift all the way up to 12, and then turning the mix down somewhere around like a quarter. You can hear that octave up is really adding a little bit of brightness, and when we put some of the other processing that I put on, you'll see that really starts to shine and bring a whole kind of different tone to the guitar. So next up, I wanted the lead to be a little bit more thick and full. A lot of these bands use chorus and doubling to make their parts a little bit more spacey and wide. So I went ahead and used my favorite doubling plugin personally, which is just by Waves, Doubler 2, and I have the doubles panned all the way left and right, just turned down a tiny bit to sit in the mix. You can see it adds a nice width to the song. Again, if we play this with the rhythm guitar, now it starts to stand out a little bit more. But we're not quite there yet. Honestly, the main thing that's really pulling this tone is going to be pedal from Ableton. This is just emulating different types of distortion and drive pedals. I really wanted this fuzz sound that I hear on a lot of these kind of modern post-punk songs, and the fuzz setting on the pedal in Ableton is just absolutely perfect for that. So I kept all the EQ settings the same, and I just turned the drive up 25%, and that's it. For me personally, I love putting a fuzz pedal after the distortion of an amp. I know other people might do it before, but when you put the fuzz after the distortion of the amp, you could hear the tone of the amp is dark in and of itself, and this really just brings out the crispiness on top that's sizzling. If we look down at my spectral analyzer over here, you can see the difference in the high frequencies when I have it off versus on. Honestly, the pedal is doing the bulk of the heavy lifting with this tone. It really sounds amazing and transforms the tone of the guitar completely into something new. And then lastly, I have the exact same reverb from the other guitars. And if we play all the guitars together, if we go into our all guitar bus, I do have a little bit of processing on here. Super simple though, nothing crazy. One of my favorite plugins to put on the guitar bus is the shred spread. That's it. Try saying that 10 times. I can't even say it once. What this is doing is a stereo width effect, acting as if you had two speakers, or two amps, and they are pulling out. It works really well to create space for the vocals. There's no vocals on this session per se, but if this was going to be sent to an artist, it's going to give them more room in the middle of the mix to not have to compete with guitars. If you have headphones on, you can probably tell the difference. I'm just going to leave it on and then bypass it so you can hear the difference. As you can hear, it really just pulls everything out, makes it sound a little bit more alive in my opinion, and of course the biggest reason, really just creating that space in the mix. And then lastly, the only other thing I'm really doing to this, just a super simple EQ that's going to be doing a little bit of sidechaining. So we just have a high pass filter, taking out some of those really low frequencies that are just completely unnecessary. Here's one of my favorite mixing tricks with guitars and instruments in general when you have a snare that is having trouble cutting through the mix without just being overly loud, is to take Pro Q3 and have a sidechain input from your snare. And we're going to go into Analyzer and make sure you click sidechain. When we put this on now, you're going to see a little red kind of strip go through. That's where the resonant frequencies are most clashing, and it's an easy way to kind of unmask is to just look at that. So you can see it's strongest in this sort of 158 hertz section. So I'm going to turn my Q up a little bit, and I'm going to turn this into a dynamic EQ, pulling it down maybe like 3 to 4 dB, nothing super crazy. You don't want this to be noticeable. So if it sounds like it's ducking, it's doing too much. And then what you're going to do is where it says auto right above the dynamics processing, click that. And there's this little up arrow which says when the sidechain input goes, do the dynamic processing. And it just basically creates a dynamic compression sidechain EQ on only the frequency that's clashing. Next, we're going to get into the bass. I do have a decent amount of processing on this bass. If you can record an actual bass, that would be the ideal situation, especially if you have a P bass. I don't have a P bass. I used a plugin. Honestly though, it's totally okay if your bass sounds a little bit fake for this genre. I used ABLP. I don't even have the full version of the plugin. I'm on the demo. As far as writing goes for the bass, you could totally do something with a bit more flavor. I wanted to keep it really simple for this record personally and just have the root notes of the guitars. I didn't feel like there really needed to be too much going on in the bass line. And here's what it sounds like without any processing. It's really already sounds a bit processed. However, I did want it to sound a specific way, and so the way that I accomplished that was using GTR Tool Rack. This is a plugin by Waves that is a stomp box with a bunch of pedals as well as an actual amp simulation. I'm using the basics preset. There's a ton of presets in here. Here's what the difference is. Personally, I just like the sound of it. It sounds more like it's running through an amp. Next, I put on what's got to be one of my favorite bass plugins of all time, CLA Bass, classic and a go-to for a reason. I had started off with a metal pick preset in here. What I like to do though is just click through different presets and then whichever one I feel like is a good starting point, I'll alter the tone from there. On this, there was too much sub. It was kind of an unrealistic amount of sub, especially for this genre. When there's too much sub, it's going to be muddy and it just doesn't sound true to the genre, I guess you could say. So I'm turning down the sub knob a little bit. I have the treble here on cut, boosting it 7 dB up to really bring out the highs, as well as a fair amount of compression here. Keep the sub off on this one, and then we have the distortion on the growl setting, and I just personally left it sort of in the middle here, and I turned the pitch widening effects off. And here's what it sounds like on versus off. You can hear it really brings out a lot in the mids and upper mids of the bass, which is where we want a lot of our bass to be sitting in this genre of music. Next is one that really is going to change the tone. And it was kind of a last minute add, but it really cleaned up the bass tone, and at least in my opinion, it was the final touch to have it fit in the mix like I wanted it to. And this is an instance of Saturn II by FabFilter, and I have it on this clean tape bass 4 bands setting. It's just adding a little bit of clean tape saturation. This is also in multi-band, so it's kind of acting as an EQ and a saturation. And here's what this sounds like on versus off. This might be a specific case use for this type of song and the bass I was using, how much sub it already had in it. However, for me, I just felt like in this particular mix, I wanted less muddiness and a bit more of that really clean sound. Next up on the bass chain, we have Neutron 4 compression, and this is just doing a multi-band sidechain compression. I really wanted to duck the lows of the bass when the kick comes in just a little bit. So if we grab an instance of our Neutron 4, set it into either modern or vintage mode, and drag the crossover points wherever you would want them to be. For this, I wanted to keep it into the low mids and the lows, and not any of the mids or highs. So we're going to click on our band here. We're going to make sure that our sidechain input is set correctly to the kick. And then we are going to go here. This is our little sidechain function. We're going to press the on and have it be to external. That's just telling Neutron to turn on sidechaining from the external sidechain source, which in Ableton I've set to be the kick. I turned down the ratio to 3 just so it wasn't as strong because I didn't want this to be a noticeable sidechain effect. and then just honestly move the threshold to where you're getting the amount of gain reduction that you actually want. And then lastly, I'm sure you can hear this white noise that's coming from the amp. I just put on a gate to make it clean and not have to worry about that. So overall, here's what the bass sounds like. And if we play that with the guitars as well. We're really starting to achieve that nice balance between the bass and guitar. And once we bring in our drums, you'll really see how all of the kind of missing frequencies get filled in. For this, I wanted to use more of a drum machine bass kind of sound rather than having a more like recorded type of a sound. The essential for all this stuff is the 505. You can find them online. You can find it on Splice as well, I believe. Just grab a 505 kick, a 505 snare, and a 505 hi-hat. And I was just looking through Splice to find some little percussion, like kind of dark wave post-punk percussion that I could add. Here's what the kick sounds like. Here's the snare. And here's our hi-hat. And then here's the percussion elements. I just feel like for me just doing that, you can already hear where this is going. On the kick, I did add a gated reverb. To make a gated reverb, it's pretty easy. You just want to take a reverb and then put a gate. You're going to have to dial in the gate settings quite a bit, as well as the reverb settings. For me, I was using Ableton's hybrid reverb to get a more realistic room sound. I'm using the Real Places Solec Up LR with a decay time of 3.5 seconds and a dry wet of 19%. And then I have the vintage turned to old, so we're just going to add some kind of warp and modulation into the reverb. Make it sound like it's been run through tape. And then for our gate, we have just Ableton stock gate. You could use Wave C1 gate or anything that's native in your DAW you can use. This is where you're gonna have to play a lot with threshold settings. If you have it too high, there's not gonna be any real sound coming from the reverb. And if you have it too low, then you're not gonna have the gated sound at all. For the return, I have it on 8 dB. The attack is really fast on 0.02 milliseconds, pretty much as fast as it can be. Hold on 5.8 milliseconds and release on 24, and the floor at negative 20.2. For our snare, originally I did have a gate on it, but once I was playing around with it more, I really found that having both a gated kick and snare sound wasn't my favorite, and so I placed another instance of hybrid reverb on this snare, also on Real Places, but this time I am in Bunker BA. Just keep it on old, same exact decay time, and then my dry wet is a bit higher this time at 25%, but it gives us a really nice, roomy snare sound. And then for our hi-hat, just left it as is, and these Splice samples were great. I don't have to do any processing on them at all. I actually played this one in on hand because I wanted it to sound like it was actually played on a drum machine. Although a great tool that you can use in Ableton now is the humanize feature. So if you're to draw your pattern in, highlight all of it, and just press humanize to the amount of percent that you've set, and it'll do something similar. This is the drum pattern that I got. And the only processing that I'm doing on this is running it through tape emulation. Oxide Tape by UAD is my personal favorite. I love it on drums. It makes drums just sound amazing and come alive. And I'm really just trying to watch the input on that, so it's actually doing something. You could clip it and get more of a clipping saturation kind of sound if you wanted. I wanted it to have that sort of tape sound, but without the clipping necessarily. So I'm just watching it to make sure that it's not going to go into the red here. And here's what it sounds like before and after the tape. It really just makes the kit come alive in my opinion, and it adds some punchiness, it adds some nice crispiness on top. And then also in this intro, just for an effect, I had RC20, and I'm doing some filtering here. I have it on these not harsh cuts, but the sort of soft low roll off and soft high roll off, and I'm just putting these down. So I have this one at 1209 on the high end and 227 on the low end. I have some distortion on the crunch setting set to 52%, and digital pretty much left right where it is at 43%, And I'm bringing the width down so that way it starts off in mono and then expands in. And so when the verse hits, you get this nice like width that comes in and makes the song sound really full, and it instantly just makes it sound like, okay, we're in the song now. And the only thing that I'm actually automating on this is this magnitude, which is a sort of a dry wet kind of a knob. So it goes all the way on. You can see my automation over here actually. Goes all the way on. And starts moving into the song. And then lastly, I wanted to talk about arrangement and some of the writing. So as far as arrangement, I knew I wanted to start off with those drums. When I was soloing them and working on them, I just absolutely loved the way that it sounded, and I was like, having some type of just drum-based intro. I grew up playing drums as my first instrument, so I might be a little bit biased there, and then just making sure that there was some type of movement in the intro, so that way it didn't just sound like a 4-bar loop of drums playing and then the song. And this is something that can be totally up to you as far as if you want to go into a verse or a chorus. I know there's different debates about whether you should just jump straight into the chorus or you should have a little bit of verse that warms you into it. For this song, I was personally just feeling going into a verse instead of going into a chorus. And I'm doing a bit of a shorter verse for this first one. I know a lot of these songs can be kind of long, especially the older ones. You might have like 16 or even 32 bar parts. But for especially the modern sound, they're keeping it pretty short nowadays with like 8 bar, 16 bar parts instead of 16 and 32. So I was like, for the first verse especially, I want to get into that chorus, not be taking up too much of the listener's time. And so started off with just an 8 bar verse and then jumping into a 16 bar chorus. And then this next part of the song is definitely my favorite part of the song. That's why I've been holding off until the arrangement. I wanted to do something as like a post-chorus that sort of switched up from the monotony of just having straight up like eighth notes playing with no rests or anything. And so I created this part with another sort of catchy lead guitar melody where we have these very intentional stops going on, which I'll play for you right now. For the lead tone there, it is exactly the same, just a different riff. And it's also the same exact chords, just being played on that kind of stop and go sort of rhythm. And as well, to make it really clean, because I do have reverb, I'm automating the on-off or the mute function for the tracks. I know there's maybe better ways to do this with like the utility. However, it's just one of those old habits that I have that it works and it's super clean. And so you can see that automation here where it stops everything and there's just no sound being played. You could also do this by freezing and flattening your tracks and then just cutting the audio. But it'll give it that really, really clean sound, like everything is just stopping on a dime and it sounds really, really tight and controlled in a very interesting way. And that part, this first post-chorus, is only 8 bars because I didn't want to take up too much time before we got to the next verse. So then for our verse 2, I took off the guitars and just left drums and bass, so we have a bit of a switch up. I always love when songs have just drums and bass. It just, like I said, drummer. And then I just brought back the guitars here for the second half. This is a double length verse in comparison to the other one, so it's 16 bar verse instead of 8. And then we jump into the chorus here. And I wanted to do something so it was a little bit of a switch up and not just the drums playing. Again, trying to think about like the storytelling here as far as the instrumentation, and especially with rock, I like to think about if this was actually played in a band setting and we came up with this song in rehearsal, there might be parts where we're like, oh, it'd be cool if the drummer and everyone stopped right here and just my lead part kept going for a second. Things like that really make it sound more alive and not just like you're playing a bunch of loops. and then we'll go into our last post-chorus, which is the exact same thing but double length. With all that being said, there you have it, how to make that modern post-punk and dark wave sound like Ecstasy or I Dress. If you want to see more in-depth tutorials like this, then subscribe and hit that notification bell, as well as like this video. It really helps me out, guys. And drop a comment with what you'd want to see next time as far as different tutorials or different sounds you want to see. Once again, my name is Sebastian. If you got to this point in the video, then thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.